Welcome everybody to Barcelona. Thank you so much for joining us here to hear about one of DARPA's grand challenges, the Spectrum Collaboration Challenge. DARPA, for those of you that don't know, DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. We're the advanced R&D arm of the U.S. Department of Defense. And our grand challenges, the Spectrum Collaboration Challenge here, are really special projects. They're a chance to actually explore areas of research that have dividends not just within the military, but fundamentally tackle a core problem, one that is felt worldwide. And we also find that our grand challenges, we tend to tackle a problem where we're trying to showcase that a new paradigm is possible. I think that's what we find here with the Spectrum Collaboration Challenge as well. SC2, as we shorten it to, is an open competition where we're encouraging our competitors from the US, Europe, and Asia to fundamentally rethink wireless. So to throw out a century-old system of static spectrum allocation and static spectrum management, and instead ask the question, what does the wireless world look like if we rely on autonomy? So of course, I think many of us here in this room know all about the spectrum, this beautiful infinite resource, or beautiful finite resource that's shared. We have all of our devices running in it. Fundamentally, the challenge that we're tackling in the Spectrum Collaboration Challenge isn't a new challenge, right? It's actually as old as wireless is itself. If we go all the way back to the age of Marconi, Marconi's first successes with broadcasting the America's Cup race from US to Europe were followed almost immediately by failures in some of the earliest known examples of wireless interference when he conducted experiments with the US Navy. That's because at the time he hadn't released an important invention, frequency tuning transceiver. This invention took us from wideband wireless transmissions and allowed us to transmit on very narrow frequencies. Little did he know at the time, though, this patent would actually become sort of the key foundation, the cornerstone of the way we've really managed wireless in the 100 years since. We've got millions of devices, many more than, of course, in Marconi's time, and governments, of course, around the world decide how they're going to allocate the spectrum, but no matter where you find yourself in the world, we're really doing it the same way, right? We've done it the same way for the last 100 years, which is that we ask people to figure out how to divvy up this precious resource. And SC2 is asking, is there another way? So issues of spectrum scarcity really loom large in a number of spheres. Militarily, we need effective, reliable access to spectrum to conduct vital missions around the world with our partners. If we move to the commercial sector, we're seeing exponentially growing wireless demand. We see it all around us here at the conference. From cellular and mobile devices, to increased Wi-Fi use, to the growing cacophony of the Internet of Things, as well as machine-to-machine communication. If we look at the public safety sector, our first responders don't really care about what their wireless access looks like on a good day. Right? Fundamentally, our first responders need to know how their wireless is going to work on the worst day, when things are acting not as we expect. And this is where we often find our wireless access lets us down, and we're unable to effectively respond. Spectrum really is lifeblood. Right? It's all around us. And it's important not just commercially, right? But governments around the world have really recognized that we need to fuel technology innovation. This recent US presidential memo, for example, underscores a number of key technological improvements that are needed to continue to use spectrum more effectively and efficiently. Specifically, spectrum sharing is called out as a key tenet. So the goal of our competition is actually really simply put. We want to engender a new wave of wireless. We want to ask for autonomous spectrum management that's enabled by collaborative, artificially intelligent devices. The essential question we're asking is this: can we rely on AI to not just get the same utility out of the spectrum that we get today, but can AI actually help us do better than we do today? And we unlock a new spectrum paradigm for management, one that is intrinsically driven by autonomous collaboration between radio systems. So, something that's important to note is that SC2 and DARPA really aren't approaching this idea of spectrum autonomy with any particular radio technology or even frequency band in mind. We're trying to ask the most generic form of the problem that we really can. But of course, if you walked more than 37 feet in this hall outside, you will have tripped over 5G a number of times, right? So we've really begun thinking about how do we take some of the technologies, and some of the approaches emerging in SC2, how can we help 5G achieve some of its goals? We think there's three areas. The first is that we think SC2 can help us get more capacity and more coverage. Second, we think SC2 can actually help us enable new operators and new applications. And lastly, we think that, perhaps most importantly, SC2 helps us get to new spectrum more quickly. Now remember these three key areas. I'm going to actually sort of put them aside for now. And at the end of the talk, we're going to come back to them and we'll dig in a little bit further, having actually seen some of the SC2 technologies in action. So we find ourselves here in this competition in its third and final year. We have 15 remaining teams in the competition, and they're vying for almost $4 million in prizes that will be awarded at our live finale event later this year at Mobile World Congress, Los Angeles. What I'm really going to spend a lot of our time today talking about is our final qualifying event, what we call preliminary event number 2. So here I've shown as PP2 in the calendar. We're really going to take a look at that event that happened in last December and use that as a way to try and explain where the current state of the art is in spectrum autonomy and try and forecast forward to what we can expect in October of this year. Question we get a lot is why the competition format? Is this the right way to ask this kind of question? And there's actually a number of distinct advantages to trying to ask questions like this in this format as opposed to others. The first is really all about community, right? In order to be successful here, we needed a community of interest that's focused on this idea of combining spectrum autonomy with artificial intelligence, with software-defined and reconfigurable radio. Next is really about diversity, right? We wanted to engage a broad range of thinkers, from academics, industry to defense researchers. And through this competition, we've been able to really bring 30 teams into the fold, and that's enabled us to traverse a much larger part of the problem space than we might otherwise find ourselves being able to explore with a smaller set of researchers. Next, we're able to actually pose this competition through some scenarios that are meant to mimic real life. And I'll show you some of those coming up later today, but we think this is really a key way that we're able to take the competition technology and more rapidly usher it from the playground of the competition and into the eventual real world. Finally, we've created something called the Stakeholders Council within our competition, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but they're really key to the way this competition is structured because they're going to help us more rapidly usher the technology from this competition into the real world. Now, DARPA has, of course, done similar grant challenges in the past where we've always tried to focus on finding and unlocking hard problems. From the autonomous vehicle challenges to the DARPA robotics challenge to the cyber grant challenge. Each of these competitions was actually about individual, isolated autonomy. SC2 is actually instead focused on ensemble autonomy, right? If we think about the wireless ecosystem, think about trying to manage the wireless ecosystem. Our success isn't measured by whether or not one radio works or maybe one radio network works, right? We have an entire wireless ecosystem, right? So it's about having all of our radio systems work, the entire ensemble. And so that's why collaboration is so important. So important that it made it into the title of the competition itself. We think it's one of the key required technologies that's going to actually enable us to unlock is going to be a real key to approaching ensemble autonomy. I want to just spend a minute here and try and show you how difficult this problem is. I'll try to put some numbers behind this idea of trying to autonomously manage the spectrum. And a good way to do that is trying to compare it to games, right? And when we ask machines to solve games, one of the ways that we describe how hard they are is by counting the number of possible moves from the beginning of the game to the end. So chess here is a nice example, 10 to the 47 moves. More recently, the game of Go, 10 to the 107 moves. But AI gameplay is great. Managing the wireless ecosystem is actually even yet more challenging. If we look at SC2, one of our challenges is that we have to consider the potential moves that each radio can make, that each radio network can make. And once you start to consider the combinatorics of that problem, we very quickly move from something that's at least countably tractable to something that approaches infinity very quickly. So one of the biggest challenges posing SC2 as a competition is you have to turn managing the spectrum into a game. And I'm going to give you a little sense of how that game is played later today, but I wanted to start by explaining the game. And it's actually quite simple when you get down to it. What we do is we take 5 different radio technologies built by 5 different competing teams. These technologies are developed in isolation. It means they use different waveforms, they use different channelization strategies, their timing may look different, and they know nothing about each other. We then take those 5 radio technologies and put them into the same geographic area. We give them access to the exact same spectrum, and beyond that, there aren't any rules. Right? There's no preconceived notion that, let's say, the gold team should get more spectrum than any of the other teams, or that we're going to divide the spectrum into 1 megahertz chunks. Instead, the 5 radio networks are given a singular shared goal. That's to maximize the total capacity of the spectrum, the total utility. You think of it as maximizing the total number of applications that can be successfully carried across that shared spectrum. And to do this, they're going to optimize autonomously how that spectrum is used in real time by collaborating and sharing information with each other, sharing plans about what they intend to do in the future, and sharing feedback about interference that they're experiencing. And by doing this, these radio teams are going to be able to autonomously optimize the spectrum. A few key building blocks for success I just want to make sure I touch on quickly. The first is artificial intelligence, obviously. On the left side of the screen here, you see really, up until recently, what the state-of-the-art in artificial intelligence has been. It's focused on single-player games. More recently, groups like OpenAI have started to tackle this idea of multiplayer games and collaborative games, but SC2 is actually even still a little bit more challenging. Because in these multiplayer games that you see here with OpenAI, all of the bots, all of the agents are trained to play the game together. Our radio systems don't know how the other radio systems play this game. That means they have to learn in real time from them. The next major area of innovation here is really about adaptive radio architectures. Right? If we make very smart and intelligent radios, but those radios can't adapt, they can't change, they can't do something different to better fit in with their environment, they're not going to be very effective. And so using software-defined radio, our competitors have built radio systems that are able to nimbly adapt what they're doing to better match the environment they find themselves in. Last but not least is all about a common language to communicate. Remember, we're taking dissimilar radio systems that weren't designed to work together, they weren't designed to coexist or share spectrum. We're asking them to do it on the fly and in real time, and to do that, they need a way to share information. We've created a language that allows dissimilar radio systems to share information so that they can solve this problem in a distributed fashion. All right, one more piece of the puzzle here. You can almost frame it in the form of a question. How do you actually carry out a spectrum sharing competition? We could take a bunch of radios and we could go put them out in the real world here, but we've got a problem, and that's variability. how do we make sure that we put every radio and every radio network through the same paces? Well, can't do it out in the real world, it's logistically impossible. So we had to make an environment. We call that Coliseum, and Coliseum is really our battleground for this competition. Coliseum allows us to emulate the wireless spectrum, allows us to emulate how 100 plus radios interact with each other, creating all the bounces and echoes that you find in the real world, and do it in a repeatable and reliable way. It allows us to capture the real world. Not only did we create this world's largest RF channel emulator in Coliseum, but we had one more problem, which is that we had to actually make it accessible to all of our radio teams. So we went one step further. We turned Coliseum into a cloud resource that can be accessed from around the world. And like a lot of AI problems, data is king. This is where we get our data. 24/7, 365, our competitors use Coliseum in order to generate the data that is so crucial for their autonomous radio systems. So I want to just say a little bit about the teams. If you look here, we can see that our teams come from a couple of varied backgrounds. Almost about half our teams are academic. Another quarter or so come from industry, and then the remainder are actually individual ventures. Small teams trying to take on this monumental problem. I mentioned earlier we have 15 teams remaining, 15 finalists here in the remainder of this competition. I don't have time to introduce all of them to you, but I'd like to actually let them, a few of them, introduce themselves to you through this video.
Hello, Brent Joseph from Team Erebus. We're a three-man team consisting of myself, Brian Padlino, and Rusty Eller.
My name is Peter Vojashik. Team Marmot is a very small team of 4 team members.
My name is John Shea. I'm a professor at the University of Florida. I'm a member of Team Gator Wings. The team consists primarily of six main members. The team lead is actually Professor Tan Wong from University of Florida.
I'm Trey Goku. So in my team, there is 4 students and me, another faculty analyst and university.
Hi, I'm Vincent Bale from Team Xylenium. We're a small, very hardworking team of 3.
I'm Ingrid Boerman. I'm from IMEC, which is a research institute in Belgium, and we are participating in the DARPA competition with a mixed Belgian-US team.
We have a diverse set of backgrounds very relevant to the competition, covering signal processing, machine learning, and RF expertise. And we also run the gamut from theory to nitty-gritty hardcore implementation.
Brian and I have experience developing various wireless MANAs and doing signal processing in FPGAs, and Rusty has experience doing networking technology, and we came together to compete in this competition.
All of us are originally from Hungary, but more or less all of us are connected to Vanderbilt, or were connected to Vanderbilt in the past. In the DARPA SC2 competition, we are an independent team. And right now we are very geographically dislocated across 2 continents and 2 countries.
We use deep learning to try to guess who's in a match with us. We have a model per team. And we also try to reason intelligently about who's giving good information in the collaboration channel. It's really important because we need to know not just that someone's compliant with collaboration, but they're sending information that's useful and accurate.
I think one thing that really helped us is that we did not have a background in RF and digital communication, so we came up with some very novel, unorthodox approach at the lower layers of our architecture.
I think we have a couple of unique characteristics of the system. For example, we have a good radio. We utilize the system based on the filter magnetic area, which has very little interference.
Just a little bit from a few of our teams, and actually 2 of those teams that you saw in the video are somewhere here scattered in the room with us today. I want to move on to start talking about preliminary event number 2. I mentioned that this was the best and who deserved prize money to really continue forward in this competition. It took us almost 5 days to run preliminary event number 2 as our final qualifying event here for the competition. So PD2 is a closed-door event for the teams themselves and a small number of VIPs, and it really helped us turn this idea of a wireless competition into something of a spectator sport. We created an esports for the Spectrum format. One of the biggest challenges here was turning this invisible competition into something that we can actually all see, something that has a face, something we can follow along with. And we've built a visualization tool that you're going to see here later today that really helps us bring that message forward. And again, at World Congress Los Angeles later this year, we're going to open this format for the first time publicly, but I want to give you a little taste about what that's going to look like today. So the competition itself had 3 rounds. Each round had multiple scenarios. And those scenarios are designed to capture different aspects of the radio design. Some are trying to test for the ability of a radio to find spatial reuse. Some of those are testing the ability to find spectral reuse. But each scenario has a specific goal in mind. And each of the scenarios is also modeled after a real-world set of circumstances, something we might actually envision these radios finding themselves in the future. Now, we don't have time to go through the whole tournament today, so we've plucked just a couple little pieces to bring and share with you. So we're going to look at one match in each round and then a montage of that final round of the competition. So we're going to start with the first round here. We're going to start with a scenario called Alleys of Austin. And to hear a little bit about what this scenario is really all about, again, we're going to look at a little video here.
Urban operations are among the toughest for dismounted soldiers. These operations also pose some of the greatest challenges for wireless communications due to the close proximity of devices and potential for interference. The Alleys of Austin scenario represents a practice sweep of a residential neighborhood by dismounted soldiers and asks the question, can artificially intelligent radios collaboratively manage the RF spectrum when operating in close proximity and with limited bandwidth? Each team represents a squad moving in formation, communicating back and forth within their squad, clearing the city as they go. Each squad consists of 9 soldiers with 1 UAV. Each stage of this scenario represents a different era of communication technology. Stage 1 represents squads from the 1990s, using spectrum to primarily transmit voice calls. Stage 2 represents the squad of the near future, where, in addition to the Stage 1 voice communication requirements, we see the inclusion of UAV command and control, overhead video, and GPS position tracking. And in Stage 3, we take a look at the highly connected soldier of the future, where, in addition to the communications requirements of Stage 1 and 2, every soldier in the squad is equipped with body cameras, transmitting GPS data in real time, and downloading satellite imagery to smart devices. Throughout the scenario, on the ground, radios will experience constant interference from radios of the other 2 competing networks, while the increasing traffic demands for each stage will put greater and greater pressure on the spectrum. There is sufficient spectrum to meet all needs of the ensemble. However, as we go from Stage 1 to 2 to 3, the margin of error becomes vanishingly small. The demand for wireless data at the soldier level is increasing, stressing the ability to allocate sufficient spectrum for our soldiers. The ability to share spectrum is key to meeting the needs of the next generation warfighter. For the Alleys of Austin scenario, those teams that are best able to collaborate and equitably divide spectrum resources.
I'll finish this sentence. Spectrum resources will do the best. There's one more thing that we need to actually introduce all of you to before we jump into this first match that we're going to look at. And that is we have to acquaint you with our visualization tool, our means of actually highlighting and showcasing what's happening in this competition. To do that, I'm going to actually rely on Kevin Barone. He's the lead technical advisor here for SC2. He's in the back of the room hanging out with the AV crew. And Kevin's going to be running the visualization tool that we're going to look at here. So if we could go ahead and move over to the visualization tool and start with a quick orientation for the audience on how this tool works. Excellent. All right, so the first thing that I want to start orienting everybody with here is the HUD, the heads-up display at the top of the screen. This shows you the three teams that are participating. So Selenium in red, Gator Wings in green, Andersons in blue in this particular match. And what we can also see in the HUD is we can see the scores that each of those teams are achieving instantaneously. And we can correlate that score with what kinds of wireless traffic they're able to handle. And so, Kevin, if you could do me a favor and mouse over we can see that now Gator Wings is getting all of their voice calls successfully delivered, but clearly experiencing some issues with that right before. And so we can now see that call is dropped and then picked back up and dropped again. I want to emphasize here that the scores, you see 11, 10, 4, but we actually see a net score of 6. We score these teams according to the weakest performing member, right? We're really emphasizing the collaborative aspect of the spectrum, and so the onus is on Team Selenium and Gator Wings here to try and help out Team Andersons, right? Try and help them get more of their spectrum goals accomplished. And so we give this entire ensemble of teams a score of 6, and they scored that pretty early on here in this first stage of this match. Now as we start to move on here into the second stage, what you're going to see is now they've got a score of 11, and so each stage is scored individually, right? The first stage had a slightly less challenging set of objectives. Moving into the next stage where the objectives got more challenging still. I now want to get us acquainted here with the spatial view, and so you can see each of our 3 squads of soldiers here moving through these streets. They're supported by UAVs that you can see moving overhead there as well. There we go, we can see our UAVs supporting them as they each move down an individual street. And last but not least, this is a wireless competition after all, and so we should take a look at the spectrum itself. And so, Kevin, if you could go ahead and click us into the spectrum and blow that up full screen. One of the first things I want to stress is that this is what we call the God's eye view of the spectrum. It doesn't represent any points on that map, that geography we just looked at. Instead, what you're looking at is a capture that's showing you how each of these radio teams is using the spectrum. So you're getting really an overall footprint of how the spectrum is used. It's meant to mimic here a waterfall display, but it's got a few extra features to it. So Kevin, if you could move us into the third dimension here. Right, and as we move into 3D, we can see that not only do we see where, frequency and time our 3 radio teams are transmitting, but we can also see the individual power levels that those teams are transmitting, right? So we really do get an accurate view of how the spectrum is being used. Kevin, if we could come back out and look at the top-down view, and then if you could zoom us in time there. As we zoom in, you can now start to see, as we go from that high-level view to the low-level view, you can now start to see these extra opportunities in the spectrum where the spectrum is not completely utilized. Okay, so a quick overview of the visualization tool. We're going to be using this visualization tool to show you 2 more matches here today. But hopefully this got us all oriented to how we're going to communicate and demonstrate what these radios are doing since they're playing in a completely virtual playground. All right, so as I mentioned, we've got time for 1 match from each of our 2 rounds here. We're going to start with the Alleys of Austin match from round 1. We called this match Beauty. I think you'll see why as we get into that match. This is a 3-team match between teams Marmot in red, Erebus in green, and teams Sprite in blue. So we can go ahead and switch over to match Beauty. Excellent. So I want to start by jumping right into the spectrum display here. And one of the first things I want to point out as Kevin blows up the spectrum display is to look at how different these radio teams are. Right? We see that the blue and red teams transmit on very different size frequencies. We see the green team is actually trying to tuck themselves into the guard bands in between frequencies. But as we get to about the 1 minute mark here, go ahead and we could see that while we had some sort of churn early on, very, very early in this match, it looks like we've come up with some stable spectrum sharing strategies. Remember, the red team is using the top and the bottom of the band here. Blue is largely using the middle, leaving the green team to sort of use this innovative strategy of trying to fit in between. I want to stress that this is actually a tremendous breakthrough, right? This looks like, of course, it's easy. They found individual strategies, but remember, our radios don't do this today, right? Our radios do not work together in order to try and autonomously determine how to allocate the spectrum. This is fundamentally new, and they did this in less than a minute. We did in less than 30 seconds. So this is great, but we really want to understand how did this happen. And so, Kevin, if you could go ahead and set me to a span that shows the whole stage 1 here. One of the first things we're going to realize is that this strategy that they came up with after about 30 seconds is actually held stably for almost 5 minutes of spectrum use, right? They've been able to use the same strategy over again, right? So what's happening, right? How are they doing this? If we could go ahead, Kevin, and show the collaboration aspect. Now what I want to do here, thank you, I want to emphasize what's happening on the left and right sides of the screen. So on the left side here, this is the past. This is where these radios have already transmitted in the spectrum. On the right side here, this represents the future, these sort of more translucent spectrum usages here. This is showing you where these radios predict they're going to use the spectrum in seconds to come. But most importantly, this also represents collaboration. This information is being shared from the red team to the blue team to the green team. Right? They're exchanging this information in order to help them create and arrive at these stable spectrum sharing solutions. Okay, so I now want to start to move on and move into stage 2. So Kevin, if we could take the collaboration off there. Right, and so we came up with a stable spectrum sharing strategy, but now if we move into stage 2, can they hold it, right? Will this same spectrum sharing approach work as we increase the amount of wireless demand on these radio networks? And Kevin, if you could go ahead and just sort of pan us to the end of stage 2 and stop there so we don't have to take too long. Perfect. And if we just hold it up there, we actually see that same strategy really held right through, right? So the strategy that these teams figured out autonomously and collaboratively early on continued to hold. Now we're into 10 minutes of this scenario. So this is great, but as the intro video let you know, that third stage of this particular match is really focused on the soldier of the future, right? The soldier that has not just voice and video, but has body cameras and is able to download imagery from their UAVs. So as you move into that third stage, what's going to happen? Many spectrum sharing strategies going to continue to hold. And now we start to see that there's motion and there's movement. The teams are now starting to react to this groundswell of demand, trying to find new strategies. And we see that, of course, this does not look as stable as the first 2 stages of this competition. This is the first, this is a preliminary result here that I'm showing you. And so as we go through the remainder of this year, we want to see the same kind of stability that we had in those first 2 stages arrive at in this third and final stage of this match. So as this match wraps up, I just want to underscore a couple of things. There's really a confluence of 3 different things that you're seeing here in this particular match. We're seeing new radio architectures, those that are driven by software-defined radio, and we're seeing collaboration amongst those radios, right? We're seeing the ability for those radio systems to collaboratively share information. And last, but maybe most importantly, we're seeing ensemble decision-making, right? Individually, green radios, red radios, blue radios are each making their own decisions about how to use the spectrum, but we see them reacting and acting jointly as a group, coming up with stable strategies for 2 of the 3 stages of this competition. If we go ahead and bring up the match summary here, I want to actually just share a personal anecdote. If this wasn't the first, I think this was the second match I ever saw from this competition. And I almost fell out of my chair. because to see this kind of stable strategy arrived at jointly by these teams, this is the hardest part of this competition. What we really feared and what we thought might happen is that these teams would always be churn, right? Sensing and avoiding and hopping and moving frequencies and never able to actually come up with a stable spectrum sharing strategy that we can rely on, one that we can depend on, one that I'm the soldier, I can actually trust that my radio is going to work. To see this hold through 2 of those 3 stages was really impressive. I'm going to tune in to see how this 3rd stage goes in our championship event later this year. So, we have over 400 matches in this preliminary tournament. Of course, not time to show all of them to you, but as we go from round 1 into round 2, we've only kept the top 12 teams, and so over match after match after match, as these radios do get out, and you can see there's positions on the scoreboard starting to stabilize. And at the end of that first round of competition, we said goodbye to our bottom 3 teams here, and we took only the top 12 teams into that final round, into that second round of competition.